Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire supported by Glenlivet Books. 11 days after the Indian and Chinese foreign ministers met in Moscow, how should we assess the outcome of their talks? And secondly, what are the chances that India can get China to peacefully withdraw from Indian territory in Ladakh? Those are two key issues I shall pursue today with India's former ambassador to China, Gautam Bambawale. Mr. Bambawale has spent 15 years out of his 34-year diplomatic career covering China. Mr. Bambawale, let's start with the joint statement issued by the Indian and Chinese foreign ministers after their meeting in Moscow on the 10th of September. In that statement, they agreed that border troops on both sides should continue their dialogue and quickly disengage. What do you make of the fact that although they wanted the dialogue to continue and the disengagement to happen quickly, it's taken the corps commanders 11 days to agree to meet?
Yeah. No, that's a good point that you make, Karan, but I believe that the corps commanders are meeting today, even as we speak, perhaps. This is the news which is coming out and which is in the newspapers this morning. So the corps commanders are meeting. Let me also say that it is a good thing that the two foreign ministers, our external affairs minister and the foreign minister of China, met in Moscow, because it shows that there is a channel of communication which is open between the two countries, not only between the foreign ministries of the two sides, but also at other levels. So I think in general, the fact that the two met in Moscow and came out with a 5-point plan of action, if you want to call it that way, is something which is positive. And some of that action is going to happen or is happening even now as we speak. And let's see what the outcome is. However, having said that, if you permit me, I'll take a couple of more minutes to just mention that, what is happening on the borders in Ladakh this year is something which is very different from what happened in 2013 at Depsang and 2014 at Chumar. And the reason why it is different is because the number of troops which are involved on both sides is much, much larger. As you know, there are tens of thousands of troops which have been mobilized in Ladakh, both by the Chinese side and the Indian side, and several divisions of troops. So the mere fact that there are so many soldiers and troops in that area shows that it is different from 2013 at Depsang and 2014 at Chumar.
There is a view, Mr. Bambawale, that China is deliberately stalling and protracting the negotiations, which is one reason why perhaps it's taken 11 days for the corps commanders to agree to meet. And the explanation given is that China is possibly using the talks to consolidate its territorial gains. How do you respond to that view?
Look, the reason why I made this point that there are large numbers of troops is to make the further point that when you have to move such large numbers of troops, it can only be in a planned or a premeditated way. So what the Chinese PLA has done this summer and now into autumn of 2020 is something which is planned and premeditated. If it has been planned and premeditated, then obviously there are certain military objectives which they had in mind. Whether all of them have been achieved, whether some of them have been achieved, I would not be able to say, because the Chinese system is very opaque, as you know, and we do not really know what their military objectives were. My own guess, my own feeling is that their military objective was to move their ground positions right up to the points where they think their line of actual control with India lies. Now, if that was their military objective, then some of these objectives may have been met, but not all of them, because the Indian army in turn has also built up and mobilized its troops and has to a certain extent blocked the efforts of the Chinese army. So if these are some of the military objectives which were in the minds of the PLA when they started this whole ball game. Then I think that it is quite possible that they are stalling for time. But that same time can also be used by the Indian Army to consolidate its positions along the LAC, which in fact I believe they are doing from all what we have heard over the last so many weeks now.
Is it just military objectives that the Chinese have in mind, or could it be that they also have a further objective, which is, in a sense, to show to the world that China is the preeminent power in this region and cut India down to size, if not actually humiliate India?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that view. In fact, the move that the Chinese army, the Chinese PLA has made this summer and now into autumn, as I said earlier, has two implications for India and for the rest of the world. One, there is a tactical implication, which is that they want to move their ground positions right up till their idea, what they think is the line of actual control with India. This is the tactical objective. There is also a strategic objective, which is what you just mentioned. The strategic objective is to show India and to show the rest of the world, perhaps, that there is a huge asymmetry in comprehensive national strength and power between China and India. And therefore, China is trying to be the hegemon in Asia. And India must understand its place in this hierarchy of nations, that we are much weaker than China. And this is a message which they want to send not just to India, but to the world as a whole. So I tend to agree with that point of view.
Against that background, I want to put you a comment made by the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson, Wang Wenbin, 1 week after the Moscow meeting between the two foreign ministers. Mr. Wenbin was asked, when will China start disengaging and withdrawing troops? And this was his answer. The most urgent and important task is for the Indian side to immediately correct its wrong course of action, disengage on the ground as soon as possible, and take concrete actions to promote easing of the situation. To me, that suggests that Beijing believes India has to do the withdrawing. It's not a question of both sides acting simultaneously and together.
Yes. Look, if you see what the Chinese have been saying even before this statement by their foreign ministry spokesperson, you will find that they are saying that India has made the initial moves which unbalance the situation, etc. As far as we are concerned, we are very clear it is the build-up by Chinese forces in large numbers which have violated all the agreements between India and China, especially for the maintenance of peace and tranquility on the borders, which has been the fact which has been changed on the ground. The ground situation has been changed by the Chinese side. So I think this is what is being reflected. As far as India is concerned, this can only be a coordinated disengagement and then de-escalation. So I think the Chinese it's going to take time to achieve this. I have a feeling that the two armies will be there in large strengths, in large numbers, even during the winter months. And it's going to take time to disengage and then de-escalate the situation on the border in Ladakh.
Let's pursue this subject of disengagement and how easy it will be a little further. Both the Hindu and the Indian Express have separately reported that the Chinese have denied India access to 1,000 square kilometers of Indian territory. Now, if those reports are correct, it's a very large swathe of territory that India has been denied access to. Do you believe diplomacy can restore the status quo ante and reverse this 1,000 square kilometer denial of access?
Look, Karan, this is some view which is being of a few people here in India. I'm afraid I don't have access to such information. I don't have access to what's actually happening on the ground. I get my information from the media also. This is a view, but I think we have to wait for the government of India to inform us whether this is actually correct. Till then, I am not going to take such a view as being gospel truth, not at all. And in fact, we have to see what is the actual situation on the ground, and that only the authorities, the army, the government knows. Sitting, in one of the cities of India, I'm afraid I don't have access to such information. How these people who are making such claims say this, I have no idea about. Perhaps they do it on the basis of imagery from satellites, but then there's a huge question of interpretation of such imagery. So I don't want to go in this direction, and I will not answer that question.
Let me ask you a different question. What sort of leverage does India have at the negotiations to persuade the Chinese it's time to withdraw?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, Karan, and let me answer that question. Look, the kind of action taken by the Chinese authorities, by the Chinese army this summer, clearly indicates what kind of relationship that China wants with India. And I am afraid that India will have to give that relationship to China. Now, as a result of the military moves on the ground, including the moves made by India, there has to be a follow-up on policy by the government of India to indicate its displeasure to the Chinese side, and to indicate to the Chinese side that it cannot be business as usual. You cannot take these military measures which disturb the peace and tranquility on our borders and then expect the rest of the relationship to remain as it is. And the government of India has commenced doing that in the economic spheres with the banning of so many mobile phone apps, by taking measures on public procurement, which will ensure that Chinese companies will not win such bids, as well as to tighten up procedures for foreign direct investment. I believe that there are other measures which will come through the pipeline in the coming weeks. So to come back to your question, India needs to respond to this through leverages both in the military area as well as in the policy area. In the policy area, I will further subdivide it into two aspects. One is the economic sphere, and the second is the political sphere. In the political sphere, we should quickly move up our strong partnerships with countries like the US, Japan, Australia, the Quad, if you may call it that way. And I think, in fact, we're moving in that direction. What will also be challenging will be to ensure that our strong relationship with Russia continues as it is. But that is something which I'm convinced Indian diplomacy is quite capable of. So we have to move on all three fronts. We have leverages on all three fronts: military, economic, and political.
There is a view that's emerging that the actual option that India faces is just twofold. Either to try and evict the Chinese militarily, and that will almost inevitably lead to conflict and war, or to grit one's teeth and accept a fait accompli, and accept also that the LAC has moved westwards to India's detriment. How do you respond to that view?
I would respond by saying that, look, time is on India's side. If does not get resolved in the next few weeks or the next few months, India must show its resolve and must continue to maintain that China must restore the status quo ante, and that can continue for even several months, maybe even up to a year. As many people on your program have said earlier, that this has happened earlier in the case of the Sumdorongchu incident, where, of course, the situation was slightly different. But India must resolve itself for the long run and for the long haul where this particular incident is concerned. So I don't completely agree with what has been said. I think that a combination of all the leverages that we have will work in the long run. And let me just give you one example, Karan. That is the example of banning TikTok. This has had an impact on other countries. You know that the United States is seriously thinking of banning TikTok, or at least changing the way TikTok operates in the US. Japan and South Korea are also now considering whether they need to ban TikTok. So if a move started by India has a snowballing effect of this kind, it shows that we have economic leverage. And I'm afraid that the naysayers are entirely wrong. India has leverages, both military, economic, and also political.
So you believe that in terms of economic leverage, even though trade with India is just 2% of China's overall trade, our tough action can cause them sufficient pain to make them rethink their behavior on Ladakh. You do believe that?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that is entirely correct. And let me give you one example, Karan. 5G. If India were to ban Chinese companies from participating in the trials and rollout of 5G in India, it would mean that apart from the United States, Australia, the UK, and even Japan, that a huge country with a huge telecom footprint like India would be added to it. It gives us a lot of leverage. It gives us plenty of leverage with Chinese firms like Huawei and ZTE.
I hear what you're saying about Huawei and 5G. Let me put to you how Sham Saran, a former colleague of yours who went on to become foreign secretary, spoke and said. He said, China has probably undoubtedly factored in the possibility that Huawei will not be considered for 5G in India, and therefore our decision not to consider them is not going to hurt China. It's been factored in.
Look, let me put it this way, and I'm afraid I've not, what you've explained to me, I don't agree with it entirely. India has a huge telecom market. Does it or doesn't it? We have almost 1 billion people who are part of the telecom market in India, 900 million if you want to. Now, that represents a huge chunk of the world market. It represents a sizable chunk of even the potential 5G market in the world. And if that were to close for Chinese companies, whatever they may have factored or did not factor, the fact is that if such a huge market shuts for Chinese companies like Huawei, it is going to be quite painful to them. It's going to be quite impactful on them. That's my view on this. And in fact, as you know, I've been urging the government of India, as an ordinary citizen, but who knows a little bit about these affairs, to ban Chinese firms from participating in India's 5G trials and rollout. It will be impactful.
I want to pick up, Mr. Bambawale, on something you said a little earlier. You said time is on India's side, and you cited the example of Sunderang, which took 7 years to sort out, but it did get sorted out to India's satisfaction. On the other hand, the Indian Express reported just 2 days ago that there are patrolling points in Depth Sound which India has not been able to access for 10 or 15 years. There, clearly, time has not been on our side, and I presume if you can't access patrolling points for 15 years, then whatever area of the LAC, which is Indian territory, which is covered by those patrolling points, is now irreversibly lost. It's going to be very hard to access those points after 15 years of denial.
Well, when I said that time is on our side, what I meant was that India's is a growing economy. There is a huge asymmetry in economic and military strength and comprehensive national strength between India and China at this point of time. There's very little doubt about that. If you take GDP as a rough and ready indicator of comprehensive national strength, we are at roughly $3 trillion. They're roughly $14.5 trillion. So 4.5 times our size is what the Chinese economy is. But I think as we move ahead, and especially as second stage reforms, second generation reforms are rolled out in India. I have great, I think positive, and I think that this asymmetry is actually going to narrow, and therefore I would argue that this is not the right time to settle the boundary or the LAC with the Chinese. Let's wait for another 10 years and then let's do it at that point of time.
Let me at this point pick up two aspects of the joint statement issued by the two foreign ministers in Moscow on the 10th of September. First, I noticed that the joint statement repeatedly refers to boundary areas. At no point does it talk about the line of actual control. On the other hand, I'm told that the boundary related accords and protocols specifically refer to the LAC. Is the difference significant?
Look, what I would say, and in reaction to your question, Karan, would be that the fact that restoration of status quo ante does not find a mention in that joint statement between the two foreign ministers is something which is significant, because the two sides obviously have not agreed to this restoration of status quo ante. As far as border areas are concerned, and I think the word should be border areas rather than boundary areas, border areas, when you don't have a defined boundary, when you don't have a boundary which is delimited on the maps and demarcated on the ground, then you refer to border areas because it's a swath of land, a swath of territory. And it comes from the fact that you don't have a defined line, an agreed line. So I would say that the use of border areas is not something which I would find very something special or would find alarming. But it also shows that because restoration of status quo ante has not been utilized in the joint statement, the 5-point statement, that the two sides actually were far apart on this issue of restoration of status quo ante. And there I would argue that India will have to stick to this bottom line of China restoring the status quo ante before they started their current moves and changed the status quo in the border areas between India and China, especially in Ladakh.
I'm very glad you brought up the fact that the joint statement doesn't at all refer to restoration of status quo ante as it applied in April, because that was the second point I was going to bring up in a moment's time. Let me add something else. It's not just that the joint statement doesn't refer to restoration of status quo ante, but the defense minister in both his statements in parliament also didn't speak about restoration of status quo ante. And I believe since then, the spokesman, the foreign ministry spokesman, talks more about restoration of tranquility and peace rather than restoring the status quo. So the problem that first emerged in the joint statement seems to have manifested itself in the language or the terminology used by the defense minister, and thereafter in the terminology used by the spokesman.
Yeah. The way I would look at it, Karan, is that yes, the terminology restoration of status quo ante does not find mention in the 5-point program, action plan, statement, joint press statement between the two foreign ministers. The reason for that is because the two sides could not agree on it. But that does not imply that India has given up its position that China must restore the status quo ante as it existed before they started all this in May of 2020, maybe even in end April of 2020. So the fact that it is not mentioned in the joint press statement implies that the two sides were not able to agree on this, but it does not imply that India or the government of India perhaps, and here I'm guessing because I'm not part of the government anymore, as you know, has given up the idea that there has to be a restoration of the status quo ante by the Chinese side. I believe that India's bottom line will be and must be that the Chinese troops, the Chinese PLA, the Chinese government, the Chinese authorities must restore status quo ante in Ladakh and in the border areas.
I accept the point you're making that the Indian government's position has been and presumably continues to be restoration of status quo ante. But given China's huge military buildup, which, as you say, is clearly premeditated, given that China clearly does not accept the need to restore status quo ante, otherwise it would have found mention in the joint statement, how likely is it that China will agree to restoring status quo ante? I know I've asked you that question in one sense earlier, but I'm repeating it because it flows from what you said. How likely is it that this will happen? I know it's our wish, it's our position, it's our demand, but how likely is it that we'll achieve it?
No, so that's where I mentioned that even if it takes time, there is no resiling from this demand of restoration of status quo ante. And even if it takes time, even if it takes months, maybe even years, India will have to show the determination and the resolve to continue to stick to this demand. And in the meantime, we will have to take action on all the three fronts which I had mentioned earlier, which is military, economic, and political.
Let me put you one reason why doubt will creep into the minds of the audience. There's no hiding the fact that India is denied access to its patrolling ports. Newspapers claim that, in fact, 10 patrolling ports are the numbers to which India is denied access, but let's not quarrel about the numbers involved. What I'm saying is there's no denying the fact that India has been denied access to its patrolling points, and in a sense, the defense minister accepted this when he responded to one of A.K. Antony's questions in the Rajya Sabha. And yet, the Indian government refuses to accept or admit that China has intruded onto Indian territory. Now, is that contradictory, as some people claim, or is it sensible for the government to play it down?
No, I don't think it's a question of playing it down. And I'm not sure what the situation on the ground is in Depsang, for example. But definitely on the north bank of Pankongso, we are quite clear that there is certain patrolling that we did in the past, which we are not able to do right now. So, yes, there are certain places like the north bank of Pankongso where Indian patrols are not able to go to the points which they used to earlier. And this is why we must ensure that the status quo ante is restored, that there is no change in what the situation on the ground was before all this started in May of 2020.
What about my question that if it's important that the status quo ante is restored, is it not also important that India should publicly say, China is on our territory, you need to vacate and get out? That is not being said. In fact, in a sense, what the Prime Minister said in June is almost the opposite, although it's been contradicted, as you know, by statements put up in August on the Defense Ministry website, which were removed as soon as they were seen. It's also contradicted by what PTI in a tweet claimed that Vikram Mishri, our ambassador in China, had said. But officially, the Indian government's position is China is not on our territory, and yet if we can't access our patrolling points, then clearly China is. So shouldn't we upfront say this? Because that will surely strengthen our position and our hand.
No, I think on the entire question which you're referring to, Karan, I feel that the government of India should share a little more information with the general public, with all of us, on what is happening on our borders in Ladakh. So I entirely agree with the fact that the government should be sharing more information, more precise information with all of us, rather than allowing interpretations and leaks, etc., to define the narrative. So I agree with you there. But also let me say that in the past too, many governments were quite cautious about sharing such information. We now have a little more as a result of the 5-point proposal between the two foreign ministers. We have a little more information because of the statements made by the Raksha Mantri, our defense minister, both in the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha. But I couldn't agree with you more that I think the government should share a little more information and more precise information with the public of India.
We're coming to the end of this interview. Let me ask you three last questions. How much reassurance or confidence do you draw, I'm not sure which is the correct word, from point 5 of that joint statement, which commits both countries to devising new confidence building mechanisms? That seems to suggest that they are, at least in some sense, looking beyond this problem and finding a mechanism to ensure such things don't happen again. Does that give you some assurance?
No, it doesn't, Karan. And I'll tell you why. There are a whole series of confidence building measures, a whole series of standard operating procedures, which have already been drawn up in the form of an architecture in the various agreements which have already been agreed to by both countries, signed by both governments, and implemented over the last 30 years. But all those principles, all those standard operating procedures have been junked by the Chinese side by the actions that they have taken since early May 2020. The very fact of mobilizing such large numbers of troops on the border is in violation of those agreements. So that is a first step, and there are many others. So if the Chinese were able to violate each and every one of the principles and the standard operating procedures that we had agreed to so far, I think we should try to restore those earlier CBMs rather than looking at new ones. Yes, once we are confident that both sides are going to stick by the earlier agreements and the measures which were taken in those agreements, then we could look for new ones. But I believe that the Chinese have violated every principle and every operating procedure which existed, and therefore all those old agreements from 1993, 96 and beyond, which helped to maintain peace and tranquility in the India-China border areas, have actually now find themselves on the dustbin of history.
Now, before you became ambassador to China, you also served as High Commissioner in Pakistan. If it comes to conflict between India and China, one hopes it won't, but if it comes to conflict, do you fear that Pakistan might try and open a second front?
No, I don't fear that Pakistan would open a second front. I know that they will open a second front. So I think we just have to plan for it. We have to expect it. And I'm sure that the country should also expect it. So if there is a conflict, this time it is going to be a two-front situation. And I'm sure that our military authorities, our government authorities are, have that scenario in mind when they think and plan for what could come in the coming months.
My last question. I see that all your ambassadorial appointments were in our neighboring countries. How much damage has this problem with China, which seems to have ground to an impasse at the moment, done to India's standing in the neighborhood and then beyond that internationally?
I think, Karan, you're going to be surprised by my answer. India's standing in the neighborhood and in the world has actually gone up. And it has gone up because India's military authorities, India's government has shown that it is willing and able to stand up to Chinese bullying, to Chinese military coercion on our borders. And we are one of the few countries in the world who is willing to do this. So I would argue with you and with your audience that India's standing in its neighborhood, as well as in the rest of the world, has actually gone up several notches as a result of Chinese military coercion or attempted military coercion on our borders.
So although this sounds paradoxical, this has actually improved our image both in the neighborhood and internationally. We are more highly regarded than previously.
Absolutely.
Well, that is a positive note on which to end. Mr. Bambawale, thank you very much for this interview. Take care. Stay safe.
Thank you, Karan.